MakerDAO.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to MakerDAO's Meet Your Delegate number 7. Today we are meeting JustinCase, one of our hopefully new recognized delegates. Just to give a brief overview of how these meetings tend to run. So we tend to have the delegates do a sort of brief presentation, kind of introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their platform, and then the rest of the time tends to go to the audience to answer questions. To ask questions of the delegates who will answer them. That makes much more sense. So bear in mind this is being recorded, so try not to sort of talk over each other. But yeah, we encourage questions, so please don't be afraid to chime in. All right, so Justin, do you want to give an introduction?
Yeah, thank you very much, Long for Wisdom. I'm really excited to be here. It's a little intimidating to be giving this presentation since I'm coming out of the shadows as a lurker just very recently, but I'll do the best I can. I'll start off with a little background. Part of the reason why I'm going by JustinCase is because I am Norwegian, which means I have a name that I have yet to hear any English speakers have any chance of pronouncing correctly. It's also a little bit to not make my identity so known, given that we're in the crypto space. But if anyone actually wants to get my real identity, I'm happy to provide that in a more private channel. My background is in business management, and before that military, which means that I'm probably coming at this from a slightly different angle than a lot of people who are in this space. I think there is some value there, and I think I have something to contribute to coming from such a background. I'm also a smaller investor. I started investing way back in 2007, and then I started with crypto back in 2017. If anyone here sees sort of a pattern emerging, yes, there is. But this has also given me appreciation for the risks involved. The arrows do not only go up, they also go down, and sometimes dramatically so. And I think that is also a valuable experience to bring into this sort of role, that we also need to prepare for the bad times, even when everyone is having a party and everyone is making lots and lots of money. Maker, I'm also kind of early to the party with Maker. I had to check my wallets. I got my first Makers way back in 2018. So yeah, just about this time in 2018. So it's been quite a ride. It's been a very interesting ride. And I think there's still a lot of way to go for Maker. Okay. So why am I doing this? It ties a little bit to getting into Maker in the first place. When I started with Maker, as I'm sure a lot of other smaller investors did, you got the elevator pitch. And the elevator pitch is that MakerDAO is a protocol that is generating revenue through lending out its stablecoins and using that revenue to burn it. And I'm sure everyone here is aware that there has been quite a discussion going around the surplus buffer as of late, because it has the increase in the surplus buffer has resulted in the burn more or less being off since way back in early June. And the voices I've been hearing and reading around echoes some of my own sentiment that this is a little bit it's a little bit damaging to Maker's reputation, because given the elevator pitch, this seems such a central part of Maker's value proposition, that prolonged periods of no burn is seen as sort of a breach of contract or leads to a loss of investor confidence. So I wanted to be a voice to give that sort of concern a voice. I also wanted to be a part of the community and contribute in a way I haven't been doing before, because as luck would have it, I have recently come into a lot more time than I'm used to having. So I have more possibility to actually contribute. Some of you may have noticed that I have been popping up around the forums voicing some opinions and some solutions and maybe some questions. And I think I can at least provide some perspectives in doing so. And of course, everything is down to the votes and how we all react. But I think there are at least some value in putting more voices to the table. And lastly, it's communicating. I think Maker, as it is today, has a little bit of a barrier to get into. I think coming from a smaller investor's background and from a business management background, I might be able to translate, for lack of a better word, some of the more technical parts into something more understandable for someone who did not have 10, 15 hours per week to browse the forums and stay on top of everything. So this leads me to three core principles or values that I am going to guide my decision process for as a delegate. The first one is maintaining obligations. This is a very important business principle, and even more so in the crypto space, where one of the usual ways of enforcing contracts is absent, because we're operating in a space that is not regulated so far. The weight of our word means a lot, and trust is built by honoring commitments, and trust is essential for the adoption and use of the protocol. The very foundation of the protocol is the stablecoin, right? If people don't believe that we will actually honor the one-to-one stablecoin promise, the whole protocol falls apart. But that trust can also be eroded from other things than losing the peg. It can come from perceived broken promises. And trust is a concept that is hard and gradual to build. You usually start out with some base trust, and then you need to prove that trust over time and build that trust with other actors. It's a long and slow process, and it takes a lot of time to build trust, but it's a very quick process to destroy trust. And you don't get to do many missteps before you start to lose a lot of trust. I think you can see some of that in the aftermath of Black Thursday, that these kind of events, like the big events, will obviously take away a lot of trust, but you can also have a gradual erosion of trust if you're not living up to the obligations you have taken on. I think a more recent example can be seen in the discussion that is going around the offboarding of the Matic token, where you sort of have parts of the MakerDAO who have made a commitment to another protocol, and there is a disagreement whether those commitments have been met and so forth. But even the act of bringing up a potential for offboarding them can be seen as a breach of commitments. And my base attitude in such a case would be to not offboard such a thing as long as there is an explicit or implicit obligation to be had. The next core value I'm going at is growing profits. Growth for its own sake, I think, is good. I mean, I want to see DAI become the leading stablecoin in the cryptosphere, but I believe that in order to do so, we must also maintain a profit growth, because the profit growth keeps Maker holders invested, and it is what aligns our interests with the Maker holders. Therefore, I will look to any proposal and see if this is helping on the path to growing profits. Of course, one way of growing profits is also cutting expenses. I don't think we are in that particular place for MakerDAO just yet. I think we're still in this early startup innovation phase, where it's more important to foster innovation and creativity than it is to curb costs. So I would rather focus on increasing revenue rather than reducing costs at this stage. And as long as we can increase revenue more than we're increasing cost, I still think we have a winning proposition, and I think that is going to be the case for quite a while yet. And as a extension of this, I think the greatest potential for MakerDAO going forward right now is in real world finance. I think there is absolutely tremendous potential there if we can do it right, because there's definitely pitfalls we can go into along the way. And the last one of my core values is simplicity. Right now, like I said, we're in a very innovative space. There's a lot of good ideas floating around, but I still think it is prudent to weigh complexity against what is being proposed. Like I'm seeing here, if I'm given a choice between a complex and a less complex solution, I will favor the less complex one. And also, if there is several systems trying to do more or less the same thing, I would want those merged into one rather than have separate systems. I would also try to avoid too many external tokenized systems and anything that adds complexity, because every time you add complexity, you add risk. And also at the user end, the more complexity you add, the higher the threshold for users to use MakerDAO. So I will favor less complex solutions if they are presented. So that is the 3 core values or principles that I will guide my decision making after. If any one of you have actually checked, I already started doing some votes, and I already started trying to put these things into practice in the reasoning for why I'm voting the way I'm voting. I'm trying to refer back to these principles and what has been weighing the most in the particular in that particular decision. That leads me to the last part that I want to talk about, which is not a principle. This is not going to guide my decisions per se, but it is a little bit about my method of work, and it goes into communication. And there's also something you can see an example of in my reasoning for the decisions I have taken, and that is communication. I think we have a bridge to gap when it comes to communication, so I will make it my job to try to make my reasoning as easily understandable as possible. That means I'm going to try to refrain from using abbreviations. I'm going to try to refrain from using too many technical terms if there is a simpler way to explain the concepts that are being discussed. My goal is for anyone to be able to go in, read these reasonings and have an understanding of why this is happening. Even people from outside who's not familiar with forums or not familiar with different technical terms can go in and get some value out of reading those reasonings. And I will also try to be active on other platforms and communities, and especially in relation to smaller investors, and try to explain Maker. I will try to drum up enthusiasm for Maker. I will try to make Maker more accessible for lesser actors, because I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we're putting too high of a bar on this, and if we're catering for only or to a large extent to existing users, then we will actually hamper our own growth. Growth necessarily has to come for someone, or not necessarily, but I think in the cryptosphere, there is a lot of potential in people who are not already using the platform. That is where our greatest growth potential lies. Obviously, existing holders, once collaterals rise in value, they will have more opportunity to mint more DAI, the way the system is constructed right now. And we can expect some growth there, but if we're going to want to see the kind of growth we've been having so far, I think we need to reach into other segments of the crypto population and try to track those. And in that, I think we need to have easier and more understandable methods of communication. So I guess that was more or less my prepared written introduction. So I hope there is some nice questions that I can answer, and I hope I have some good answer for you. Like I said, this is a little bit intimidating because I have been listening to a lot of very intelligent people with a very deep knowledge of all these systems speak and write their opinion. And like I said, I'm not coming at this from a technical background. I'm coming at this from a business background. So I might not be as well versed in those particular technical details just yet. But like I said, I'm fortunate enough to have a lot of time to be able to devote to this. So I think I can only get better as I read more. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Justin, for the intro and sort of the platform. Yeah, open up to questions. Anyone, feel free to chime in.
I've got a question. Just trying to figure out how to ask this. Well, I guess, yeah, first of all, good to meet you, Justin. Thank you for taking the time to do this. So I'm curious, with your background in management, one of the ongoing challenges in the DAO is, figuring out how to deal with things that traditional businesses enjoy. So a few examples, one ongoing issue has been figuring out like a framework to get legal advice and act on that. There's a lot of weirdness because we have different core units can get different advice, and that's different from the DAO getting advice as a whole. I could also throw out examples like HR and even operations in general are just a little weird. So I guess coming from your background in management, have you had a chance to think about like the quirks of operations and management within a DAO versus a regular organization? And do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's a very cool question, actually. The thing with a MakerDAO is you have a very flat structure, right? And you have several autonomous units. So I think you do have something of a coordination problem. And as you're rightly pointing out, in a more traditional business, you would have more of a hierarchy of this. You would have more specialized units taking care of accounting, legal advice, HR. But we're trying to build a decentralized organization here. And I think part of that is actually trying to live with some of these pains and trying to figure out. I see some good things going forward with some of the strategy meetings that is trying to put a little bit of more coordination into the effort, at least. I think that is the most important thing to sort out first. And maybe some of these support functions, as it were, could in time be more their own core units that other core units could interact with, which might be a way forward, I think. I think at some point we have to figure out some way to set more followable objectives for the core units, so they have more of a guidance of where they want to go. When it comes to legal, it's a bit of it's a pretty complex issue, right? Because one thing is getting legal advice, but the first question when you're getting legal advice is for which jurisdiction. And obviously US is going to be a very important jurisdiction, but MakerDAO could potentially be embroiled in legal disputes in any jurisdiction in the world. So already there you have some issue on how to tackle this. And I think for now there is some value in having this experimental approach to the whole thing, because we are working on the frontier here. This is uncharted land, and if we can come up with workable solutions that can satisfy legal stakeholders, I think we are well served by sort of making our own rule set and kind of presenting this to lawmakers otherwise. Because I think when it comes to legal issues, I think the primary concern different governments have is that they want to protect their citizens from scams. They want to protect their citizens from economic instability. These are the major issues that governments hold. So, this is getting a little bit long-winded, I think. Let's try to go back to the organization. It's definitely a challenge. I can definitely see the challenge, but I think for now we kind of just have to live with it and feel our way forward. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Appreciate your comments.
I kind of wanted to probe your thinking a little bit on the surface buffer. You mentioned, kind of burning and that being important. Curious if you had a mental model or I don't know, some sort of way to determine like what an appropriate surplus buffer is, right? Like risk might say a percentage. They tend to look at percentage of non-stable assets. Others might argue for a multiple or a fraction of projected expenses. Like going forward and voting on those, is there any sort of model you're kind of sticking to for considering the surplus buffer size?
Well, obviously there are several claims to the surplus buffer, if you will. There are other competing objectives on this one, and I think a very telling example is that right now we're having a discussion about raising the surplus buffer from a risk management perspective. We want to keep it at a certain percentage of the outstanding funds, right? Which is a very understandable position, and I have no problem with that. At the same time, you have what I started arguing with. We have this perception that a prolonged period of no burn is bad for our reputation, losing investors' confidence and so on. And on the third side, we're also using this one for running expenses, right? So now we have oracles coming in very soon and removing a fairly substantial chunk of the surplus buffer, which is also in part a risk mitigating measure, right? Because they need the funds to put up their own risk fund to make sure they have gas to cover the oracle costs. So I think in many ways, I think risk needs to play a central role here in determining what is an appropriate size. And I think if risk is arguing, okay, we need a certain percentage of so and so, I will absolutely support that as a target. But there is a timing issue here, and there is how are we getting to that target? Because I think when you sort of take these ones, put it up together, we need to sort of try to make a compromise between these different stakeholders and their interests in what we're doing with the surplus buffer. And obviously, say the surplus buffer according to risk should be 2.5%, and that would today mean 190 million, right? Okay, that's one risk. Then you have the oracles; they need their money right now. Should we reduce the surplus buffer even more? I think we sort of have to make a compromise between these different risks and have to accept that, okay, we're maybe going on with a little bit higher risk than we actually want to, but we're working towards closing that gap. So in this particular case, I would sort of agree with risk on the target, but I would most likely, or I will be arguing for a more gradual response, which we sort of have seen a discussion about already. Ideally, I would want this to be based out of percentages, but I know there's technical limitation to do that. So we're essentially forced into this either all or nothing scenario, which means that in some days we're not going to burn anything, otherwise we're going to burn 100%. Overall, we might end up at a certain percentage. And also with that, we do run the risk that we're making that decision now based on the criteria as they are right now. Assuming the bull market holds, maybe like with the current data or settings, we're ending up with maybe a burn of 60%. But hey, 2 weeks down the line, suddenly our profits has grown by another 10 million a week. Now we're burning 70%. Which I think it's a bit unfortunate. I would rather we be able to set a percentage limit and leave it at that, because you had seen the flip side of that whole thing in June, when you sort of had this compromise that we wanted to burn about a third of the profits. It worked well for a few weeks, and then suddenly the revenue fell off a cliff, and like as expenses rose, the profits fell. We needed to increase the surplus buffer, and all these events together conspired to have a prolonged period of no burn. Let's try to make this concrete in the coming days, because we actually have some we have an actual pulse on this. I think for the coming time, the funds that is needed for the oracles, they just have to go, right? Which means that we're going to see a drop in the surplus buffer the coming few days. Which means for the coming vote, I'm most likely going to vote against not increasing at this time, because I would ideally want to refill the surplus buffer up to our 60 million that we have right now, and then start raising the buffer at a gradual burning pace to sort of try to make a meaningful compromise between these different objectives. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the delegate compensation situation. So right now we have the trial for delegate compensation happening. Do you have specific feelings about, I guess, the way that delegates should or should not be compensated, as well as like to what extent, I suppose?
This is a question I think is not really well suited to be answered by a delegate, because I think the question of delegate compensation is a conflict of interest in its very nature. In these kinds of discussion, I would prefer someone else to actually do the discussion and arrive at a meaningful conclusion. Because I mean, even the most virtuous person can argue from it's as well as he can, but I still think it's impossible to do this without the bias, because you're directly benefiting from whatever is being proposed. I will say this though, I do think delegates should hold a meaningful amount of maker, because I think that is a part of aligning the interest with the interest of the protocol. I think I as a delegate should have skin in the game. I do have skin in the game. I mean, in relation to Wales, it's not a lot, but to me it's around 2 years worth of salary. So it is a meaningful. Should that go tits up, that would be a meaningful financial loss to me, and I have incentives to make work in the long run. And I think that is something that should be a criteria for all delegates as a way to align interests. Ideally, I think the maker should actually be locked up for a period of time, as long as you're serving as a delegate, and maybe a year, 2 years after, so that we're making sure that everyone is acting in good faith and acting for the good of the protocol.
Thank you. Fantastic response. Appreciate that.
All right, we've got time for one more quick one if anyone has a last question you want to ask.
I guess quickly, like, does your pro-burn sentiment apply to like MKR as well in terms of like vesting? Would you be against minting MKR for vesting purposes?
Like the protocol minting the MKR?
Mm-hmm.
I can see where you're coming from, but I think also part of the maker story is this notion that, okay, there's a million maker minted. Okay, I know it's not entirely true right now, but I think there is some value to that optics of maker having a set pool, and this pool is constantly shrinking. I think we run an additional risk by minting, even though to do a business parallel, a company both issues and buys back stocks, right? In effect, minting and burning maker is some of the same mechanisms. But I still think this whole idea of this one round number, it's going to shrink and it's going to increase the value of maker holders. I think it's too valuable to mess with. So I would not want us to, at least my initial stance would be to not mint more maker for vesting.
Okay, yeah. Thank you everyone for the questions, and for Justin for taking your time to speak to us all. Yeah, I guess Justin, before we finish, is there any sort of shout outs you want to do? Any links to forum accounts or Discord accounts, or anything you want to share?
Well, I kind of just want to say thank you to the whole community. I mean, it's it's a very enthusiastic and very knowledgeable community, and it's very inspiring to interact with because there are so many people that is so vested in the success of this project that I'm really happy to have this chance to be a part of it. These last few weeks when I've really been dedicated more or less full time to this, it's been extraordinary, and I can't wait to keep on doing that.
Awesome. Yeah. I guess if people want to get in touch with you on Discord, on the forum, you're at JustinCase.
Yep.
Cool. Right. Yeah, we'll get you up on the UI very soon for so people can start delegating. But yeah, thank you, Justin. Thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, I'll hopefully see you all at the next meeting. Thanks, guys.
Maker down.